The verse claims a powerful man reached the setting place of the sun and found it setting into a blackened, muddy spring of water. In terms of scientific errors in the Quran, it can't get more blatant than this verse, and it was probably the verse that I was most shocked to discover, and the one that eventually allowed me to realize for the first time that the Quran is at best compromised, and at worst a complete fabrication and falsely attributed to a divine all-knowing source. Now moving to the third point, there's another major flaw in the argument of apologists who claim it was only from the Qur'an's perspective. It's a hadith from Muhammad confirming where the sun sets every evening. Here it is, narrated from Abu Dhar. I was sitting behind the Messenger of Allah who was riding a donkey while the sun was setting. He asked, "Do you know where this sets?" I replied, "Allah and His Apostle know best." He said, "It sets in a spring of warm water." Now, we can see it's ridiculous to keep insisting the Quran didn't mean it actually set in a muddy spring. We have a hadith direct from Muhammad where he tells us that the sun sets in a muddy spring. Now, a Muslim might say not all hadiths are true, and they would be correct. So let's quickly recap what the main classification of hadith authenticity is. The very best hadith you can get is Sahih, which is considered by mainstream Muslims as 100% fully authentic. Next we have Sahih Hasan, which is basically accurate. Next we have Hasan, which means good. Next we have Da'if, which means a hadith is weak. Finally we have Mawdu', which means fabricated. This hadith by Muhammad about the sun setting in a muddy spring is classified, yes, you guessed it, Sahih. So the top classification.
Hadith mentioned in Sunan Abi Dawud. Now the interesting thing about this is that it's not found in Sahih al-Bukhari, which is a much more authentic book. And we have another hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, which is very similar in the wording, and there is no mention of the sun setting in muddy water. And what is even more important is that most scholars of tafsir and even other sciences don't mention this hadith. Somebody, for example, like Ibn Kathir, the way he compiled his tafsir is that he collected a hadith, individual hadith for each of the different ayat, all that he could find, and he didn't mention this particular hadith. And in fact, I will show you that scholars for the first 200 years didn't mention this hadith either. And also, they didn't mention that the sun physically enters into the earth or into a muddy spring. So that's my next point regarding what scholars say. So before that, let's listen to what the argument is.
The first tafsir we have a record of came in the year 104 of the Islamic calendar, which correlates to the year 722. This tafsir is called Tafsir Mujahid. This was written roughly 90 years after the death of Muhammad. What's interesting is that it interprets the verse exactly as it's written. All it does is give us more detail on what this spring is. He tells us it's blackened and muddy. So when do Muslim scholars start to tell us that the sun doesn't actually set in a muddy spring?
So for those who missed it, let's hear what he said just a second ago.
What's interesting is that it interprets the verse exactly as it's written. All it does is give us more detail on what this spring is.
The big issue I have is that nowhere in this tafsir does it mention the sun setting in a spring. I've provided the Arabic text in front of you. So the fact that it's not mentioned, he's saying it actually supports his view. But in actual fact, it doesn't support either view. So he should have at least mentioned that. Okay, let's hear the rest of what he has to say.
The second one, which appeared 15 years later, no, they still didn't have a clue. How about the third one? No. Fourth? Nope. Fifth? Nope.
Now, if you noted what he just said, he said they didn't have a clue. What that indicates to me is that he believes that they believe that the sun set in a murky spring and that they didn't know the reality. That's what it suggests to me, the way he said it. But there would need to be evidence to suggest that they believed that it physically set in a muddy pool. If we go to the next tafsir on the list, which is Tafsir Gharib al-Quran, it's attributed to Zayd ibn Ali. And this was 120 of the Hijrah. And all it mentions is one line about what the word hami'a means. And it says ma'nahu sawda, black. So the question is, why are you giving the audience the wrong assumption that all these tafsirs support your view? So the next one on the list is the tafsir of Sufyan al-Thawri. And on the website it says تفسير هذه الآية غير موجود. It's saying that there is no tafsir for this ayah. It's not found. So the next one says تفسير مقاتل bin Sulaiman, and that's 150 Hijrah. And in fact, this tafsir does not mention anything about the sun setting. The only thing mentioned about the sun is the following. This is attributed to Ibn Abbas, where he says, إذا طلعت الشمس أشد حارا منها إذا غربت. And all that means is the heat of the sun is stronger when it's rising than it is when it's setting. It's talking about the heat of the sun. Nothing to do with the sun setting. So we've gone through 4 tafsirs and none of them mention that the sun sets in a murky or black spring. Not even one. And the last one I want to mention, this is in 211 after Hijrah. The tafsir of Abd al-Razzaq al-San'ani. And once again, if you read through this tafsir, it doesn't mention the sun sets in a muddy spring. However, if you read these tafsirs, they all have one thing in common. They don't speak about the sun, but they speak about the spring, the ayn, and they talk about its nature. Because the sun setting is a common occurrence, but it's the actual spring. There was something significant about it. And actually, I hope to do a video on this particular matter, on this particular spring, and what scholars say about this, which is quite interesting actually. But that's for a later lesson, inshallah. I hope that's clear, and I'm not denying that there are scholars that say it entered into the spring, because some do. But this is their interpretation. Tafsir scholars are human beings. They make mistakes. If they interpret, that's their opinion. It doesn't mean the Quran says that. And nor does it indicate, which I've noticed some non-Muslims saying, that the Quran is ambiguous. In fact, it mentions details which are necessary and leaves out details which are unnecessary. Everything in the Quran that's mentioned has a significance behind it. Every single word mentioned in there. And what's even more important about all this are the lessons to be learnt in the story of Dhul Qarnayn. That's the whole point. He was a leader, and his leadership is guidance. And inshallah, in my next video, I'll be speaking about the language related to the Quran, which obviously is the most important. What does the Quran actually say? So inshallah, I hope to have that up soon. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.